Hello there, Parth Sharma this side, bringing you best chess games going all around the world. Do take time to like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel. If you are already subscribed, then do press the bell icon for future notifications, and if you like my work, then do consider supporting me on Patreon and PayPal. You will find the links in the description because your support is my motivation which keeps me going. Also, if you want to watch a specific game, then you can click on the timestamps given in the description box so that you can jump straight to the game that you want to watch. So the third set between Anish Giri and Jan Nepomniachtchi took place today in the semi-finals of the Chessable Masters tournament when the scores were tied 1 apiece after 2 sets. So it was do or die for both of these players to face Magnus Carlsen in the finals of the Chessable Masters tournament. So who will prevail? I will be showing you all 3 decisive games that took place in this set. So stay with me till the very end. We start from game 1. In game 1, Jan is white and Anish Giri is black. So there we go. Knight f3, d5, e3, knight f6, c4, e6. This is so-called ready opening, and white can play d4 as well to transpose it into somewhat Queen's Gambit declined variations, where black normally plays bishop to e7, but he plays knight to c3. He accepts the Queen's Gambit, but this time it's not a gambit because the pawn is placed to e3, which gives the bishop an opportunity to recapture back its pawn. So far so good, and this call system, this is all pretty much known stuff. Therefore, there we go, e4, cd4, knight d4. And now white has a space advantage here, quite a lot space advantage, but there are some, I would say, fragile squares such as these squares c5, d5. So if black manages to play the bishop to d6, that things would turn out to be great, and which he does. Bishop e3 by Jan, and now both sides castle. No, black castles, Anish castles. White plays rook to c1, b5, just kicking that bishop. Bishop to b3. Now this is a very critical moment. The knight cannot develop itself here because the white knight is taking care of it. And Anish here decides to play bishop to b7 for some reason, allowing Nepo to take the pawn on e6. And well, actually Giri can take this pawn, take this bishop with his pawn, and have this material imbalance in which he has a rook and two pawns for 2 minor pieces of white. Position would be, as I said, little bit imbalanced, but white would still have better opportunities because black pieces are somewhat misplaced and the queen side hasn't developed yet. So white would have an edge in that case. But after bishop takes e6, Giri takes the pawn on e4. Surprising. And I should say surprise. This was gleefully captured. Bishop takes, and now queen to g4. So if pawn takes, you take this bishop and things would be fine. So that bishop tucks back to g6, and now this bishop is attacked. So you play bishop to f5 to trade the bishops, and now the best move here in my opinion should have been to play bishop to e5. And if this knight moves, then you can capture this pawn, and let's say for instance if this knight doesn't move, then you can just take this knight, and this position should be rather equal, not better for any sides, but still be better, I would say an equal position with equal opportunities. But the problem is this knight is straight in the straight line of one of the potential rooks, so that can be a little bit dangerous in this position. However, Giri plays queen to a5 check, and instead of playing king to e2, which would have been a better option, I would say he plays king to f1, and let's say if you take the pawn on a2, then h4 and white's queenside attack starts. So after king f1, Giri plays bishop to e5, bishop takes g6, h takes g6, h4, and now the best move should have been to capture the knight. And after bishop takes, queen d2 looks like a fork, but actually it's fine. After rook to d1, the rook is successfully defended and the position is still roughly equal. But here Giri goes for material. He takes the pawn on a2, which is a terrible blunder in this case because now the Harry is on the charge again, and it's not a good way. For instance, if black goes for material again, grabbing another pawn, well, this looks devastating because after h takes, f takes, and queen e6 check is monster. So you cannot afford that. Or let me show you the full line. Queen e6 check, rook f7, then rook c8 is actually mate. And the simple would have been to just play bishop takes d4 and that would be fine. But Giri plays queen to d5, still okay. So h takes g6, there we go. Nepo opening lines for this rook. Pawn takes, and Nepo actually can take the pawn. Perhaps he was worried about losing this knight on d4. Well, see what happens if Nepo would have taken the pawn. In fact, he played another move which I will show you. Nepo didn't play queen takes g6. As I said, he was worried about this knight. And what happens if black takes that knight? Well, then bishop actually can take, and you cannot take this because of queen e6 check, already mentioned. The queen is somewhat overloaded. It has to guard with this e6 check from this queen, and there's no time capturing this. And there's already a mate threat, so if rook a7 defending the mate laterally, then queen h7 check actually forces matters, because after this and rook c8 check, black is losing its queen, and it would be mate very shortly. So the best line after queen takes g6 is not to capture this knight, but rather to play knight to d7. And if that same thing happens, let's say rook to c7, the bishop is pinned, so it cannot take the rook. Rook a to c8, rook takes, queen to h8 check, king to f7 is the only move, and then you lose the rook. So, well, on the board it looks like white is a rook up. Bishop takes d4, looks like white would still be exchange up, but you don't have to take this bishop. You can simply play rook to h8, queen g8 is threatened, otherwise it would be mate very shortly. So he could have taken this pawn, that would have been a better option, but instead Nepo plays knight to e6, and this could give black some breathing space. He plays rook to e8, the rook was hit, and now he restations his knight, and Giri plays bishop to f6, and here I will give you some time if you can find the best move, which unfortunately Nepo couldn't find. I will give you some time, take a pause and think what the best move in this continuation should be. Well, if you found it out, brilliant. And if you want to see what Nepo didn't see while the game was on, and the best move here should have been rook to h8, and I should say it should have been played. And this is the best move, sacrificing the rook. But what do we get now after queen h3 check? all moves are forced. King to g8, queen h7 check, king f8 is forced, the only move, and now bishop to c5 check. The king has no squares, so you have to either bring the bishop or to take the white bishop. But then this will be mate, queen to h8 if you bring anything. So, and if you bring the queen, by the way, I should say, and bishop takes d6 and mate will follow. So the only way to defend mate is to capture this bishop. But then after rook takes c5, rook a7, queen takes g6, white is just crashing through. This is totally hopeless for black, and mate will follow soon. But after bishop f6, Nepo plays king to g1, and suddenly tables are turned because it looks like now the position is level. Giri takes, bishop takes, knight c6. Now black is developing its pieces, bishop to e3, tucking back that bishop so that bishop c5 is ready. Knight to e5, attacking the queen, queen tucks back to h3. With the very same idea is to play queen h7 and bishop c5, or to capture the pawn. And here Giri was running very low on time. He was about 25 seconds, whereas Nepo had around 3 minutes in this position. And Giri, under time pressure, he cracked and he played knight to c4. Best move would have been to play king to f7, but knight to c4 actually loses because after queen h7 check, king f7, bishop h6, attacking the pawn cannot take it because of the pin. And the best move would have been to play rook to g8, but I am afraid that also would have been lost. Queen to e5 was played in order to defend this, but now the corner rook takes the center stage. And what do I mean by saying it? Rook f3 check, there we go. After king e7, rook takes c4 was another mistake by Nepo. Then after queen e1, it looks like things would have been equal, but as I said, Giri was very low on time, again crumbled and played rook h8 check. And probably the best move here for white is to play bishop to g5 to force matters. The queen won't be able to take because of all these rook checks would eventually catch the king. But he plays queen takes g7, goes for simplification. White is a piece up, he will take the queen, and here Anish Giri resigns the first game. So Nepo is 1 game up after the very first game. So what happened in game 2? Let's have a look. This is the game 2. Anish is white, Nepo is black. There we go, almost the very same opening, but he goes for this London system. And with c5, e3, just to create that umbrella of pawns, as I said, cd, ed, and now queen to b6. Well, there is no queen to b3 because white hasn't played c3, a normal move in London system openings. Knight to b2, and actually it's possible to take the pawn on b2 in this case, which Nepo didn't. He can, but after rook to b1, you can see that this queen would be somewhat restricted if he goes for another pawn, and position still looks equal, but the problem is this bishop cannot develop properly because this pawn is hit. And if you, let's say, play b6, then bishop b5 check can be really annoying, or even knight e5 for that instance could be very annoying move. The chances are that if a3 squares gets covered, that this queen might be running very low on squares. It's another possibility. Well, in fact, it's white to move in this position, so he would play bishop b5 check, bishop d7 after bishop d3 b6, knight to e5. You just attack this bishop, and black, although has 2 pawns, but is still very much running very, I would say, is lagging very behind as far as development is concerned. So not a good sign. That's why Nepo didn't take on b2, plays knight c6 first, and now knight to b3, more concentrated on the development, as we think not going up behind the material, just going behind the development, and when you see an opportunity, just cash onto it. Bishop to g4, pinning this knight, and up to now so far so good. a4, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and if you, let's say, go for this knight here, then chances are that bishop b5 check could be played, or even, let's say, queen to c3 might be unpleasant move, and so on. So anyway, e6, queen to d1, a6, c3, now giving more protection, and this queen is now defending this knight on b3. So knight to e4, a5, attacking, not only attacking the queen but also cementing this majority, not majority at the moment, but cementing this pawn structure. So if in case these pawns go, then this pawn is safely secured on a5 square. Queen to d8, bishop to d3, bishop to d6. Well, Giri can take this bishop on d6, but he plays queen to f3, wants to exchange bishops this way. Bishop takes, queen takes, and now knight tucks back to f6 because it was attacked twice, and the pawn would have been taken if in case he allows this capture. Both sides castle now, and now rook f to e1, basically to stop e5 and the possibilities of e5 if they occur. So rook to e8, there we go, we talked about that. Rook to e2, the intention of probably doubling the rooks. Rook b8, h3. Well, in fact, he can play knight to c5 in this. Should I play knight to c5 instead of rook e2 on the previous turn? That could also be better, but there are always chances that you might lose a strategic move or strategic opportunity if you play moves such as knight to c5. So knight to h3 was played, knight to d7, queen to d6, queen e7, offering trade of queens, which Giri gleefully accepts, f4, h5, g4. So now the king side pawns are rolling through hg, and obviously you have to push your pawns because now queens aren't on the board, so there aren't any, I would say, dangerous threats. Rook a to e1, doubling the rooks, knight f6, attacking the pawn, so f5, and if this is taken, then you can take here and pawns would still be equal. So take the g pawn, takes, and then knight takes, and in fact, if you play like this, bishop takes f5 would still be possible, but the thing is that rook actually looks like it's defended only once, but in fact it's defended twice, which in fact I missed on the first instance. Rook to f1 looks like going straight into the fork, because if you, let's say, if Giri, beg your pardon, Nepo is black, so if Nepo plays knight to g3, then rook g2 actually wins the piece, the knight is pinned. So Nepo doesn't go for it, he plays knight to e4, bishop takes, pawn takes, and again if this, then this. So knight to c5, king to f8 so that this pin doesn't exist. So knight takes e4 protects this knight g3, king to e7, so activating the king, king to f2, Giri does the same, rook to h8, giving some opportunity to check this king. So king goes to e1, and now both rooks take these two available open files. d5 by Giri, rook to h6, rook to f4, and rook h1 check. Probably should have played rook to d8 in this position, try to pull up more pressure, because Because of this, the pawn should not take because there would be any threatening discoveries on the cards. King to d2 was played. Now comes rook to d8. So the pawn is pinned, it cannot capture the pawn. Okay? And here Nepo misses this tactical shot. Instead of rook d8, he should have pulled his rook back here, or maybe to double his rook, but he played rook to d8, and rook takes f5 actually loses a piece by this. Either knight g3 or knight f2 check picks the rook, this discovered attack, and the rook is lost. But there are hopes, because if Nepo manages to eliminate all the pawns, then things could be fine. Let's say he plays knight to f2, he has to bring his knight back, rook to a4, so he's basically cutting this king. That king doesn't approach, and now b4. So now making this wall so that this rook doesn't come this side and blocks the path of this king. a5, so pressurizing this pawn. Knight to d3, ab, cb, the pawn is defended by the knight, and now black's only aim is to eliminate this last pawn without losing this rook, using either king or any of the pawns, but pawns cannot challenge this pawn, so he has to use rook and so king and rooks to eliminate this pawn, and it's not too easy. Rook goes to a6, knight c5, and now rook to d6. Well, he can't actually take this pawn, but then rook b6 will be a fork, and you might lose this last pawn as well. Not ideal. So rook d2, offering trade of rooks. f4 check actually doesn't help, because after king takes, black can actually take the rook, and probably that would have been a better option. Rook takes, then knight e4 check, and this pawn is there, and if white defends this pawn, then white is winning very sweetly. After king takes f4, Nepo declines the capture of rook, and now king activates, and this is totally lost. They are just formality moves. Rook to c7, now rook f2 check, king e7, rook e2 check, king to d8, knight e4 is coming out of the capture, rook e7 just pinning the knight, but rook f2, pawn is hit, king c7, and after knight d6, Nepo resigned, so the scores are leveled, one apiece. Obviously you cannot defend this pawn on f7, it will be captured anyway. If you push this pawn, then rook takes pawn anyway, f6, and even on this square itself. And if you, let's say, play this, then rook takes, which comes with pin, nasty pin, and with this pawn white will win the game. So one apiece after first two games, and next two games were also pretty amazing, but they ended in a draw. The first game also ended in a draw, so we come to the second Blitz game between these two, and here Giri is white, Nepo is black, and we see almost same thing but with a twist. Now he's going for possibly either a King's Indian or Grunfeld, so he goes for Neo Grunfeld, somewhat anti-Grunfeld, not anti-Grunfeld, but just a similar type of counter, and there we go. Both sides castle, and now c4. Looks like very much Catalan structure, but actually it's pretty much looking like Neo Grunfeld structure, which actually is a Neo Grunfeld defense. c6, queen b3, so far so good, everything is very well known. Queen b3, queen b6, knight to c3, rook to d8, bishop to d2, pawn takes, queen takes, and you can actually take the pawn, but then I will show you what would happen if that happens. For instance, if you take the pawn, first black plays bishop to e6, and now queen to a4. And in this case, actually, if you take the pawn, the queen will be trapped, and it would have been trapped anyway, because let me go one move back. So if queen takes, then rook b1 hinders the development of this bishop, because there will be a constant pressure on the pawn on b7. And another possibility would be is to play rook to a3, and that way you can somewhat trap, not trap fully, because white would have this queen a6 square, but still trap in such a way that although it's on the board, it actually serves nothing. So we come back to the game. Queen a4, bishop f5 is played, and if you think that after rook c1, rook f to c1, you can take the pawn because the bishop is covering this b1 square, I'm afraid it would be deadly, because after queen takes b2, this queen would be trapped. And by playing rook a b1, taking that rook doesn't help because the queen is trapped anyway. He plays knight b2 d7, and now b4 by Giri. Knight to e4, e3. So knight gets traded off, but I would say Nepo has found I would say good positional structure here, because this bishop is somewhat very poor, biting down on these two pawns without any independence, and this is unpleasant for white. Obviously this bishop somewhat locked down, and we are listening this word lockdown for a lot, so this is somewhat that case. So bishop to e4, queen to b3, bishop restations itself to d5, queen to c2, knight to f6, knight to e5. Now bishops get traded off, but not this bishop against this, but rather both light square bishops get traded off. Knight to d5, and Giri would happily accept this knight taking this bishop, but after knight d3 he actually doesn't. He plays queen to c7, and after a4, rook a to c8. Seems like both sides are creating battery of there on the c file, and black is looking to play b6 and c5 any moment. He's totally not intending taking this bishop, because this bishop is relatively poor. So rook a to b1, so he wants to play b5, h5 by Nepo, h3, h4, and now gh4. So this is a very brave sacrifice by Nepo on h4, because it opens up this queen's line here, and this is an extra pawn which also can be used for attacking purposes. And you can take this bishop on c3, but as I said, he doesn't want to, and why would he? So probably either to play queen d6 may be the better option, or maybe, who knows, even queen b8 or b6, but certainly probably not taking this bishop on c3, this poor piece. He plays bishop to f6, and now this pawn becomes a bit of nuisance, because now you have allowed this. If you're going after it, now h5, g5, and it looks absolutely crazy. And if you have taken it, then this line would have been open for black, I would say for white, because of the queen invading the space, invading black space, and that would be devastating. Knight to c5 by Giri, king to g7, so he's trying to bring one of the rooks to attack the pawn. Knight to e4, rook to h8, there we go. Queen to e2 defends the pawn. Rook to h6 with the simple intention of doubling it to capture this. b5, and he doubles the rooks. Knight to g3, now put more defenders to this, and especially the knight, so which means that the queen can move freely. e6 defending the knight, or I should say giving more protection to the knight, or also making room for this bishop to use the e7 square, which he does after bishop d2, bishop to e7, b takes, and now Giri plays queen to a6, attacking this pawn twice. And if this rook comes here, then rook b7 would be devastating. So he goes queen d8, gives up this pawn, knight to f6, probably rook e8 would have been a better option, but I'm afraid he's already lost. Rook to b7 was unstoppable, knight takes, rook d7, queen f8, d5 by Giri, knight takes g3, pawn takes g3, maybe to check it first would have been a better option, but Nepo returns the favor by playing rook takes h3 because this loses the rook in the corner, and if you play like this, then this bishop is pinned. You can actually play queen b7 and pick this bishop. He plays bishop c3, king g6, the rook is taken, pawn takes e6, very calm from Giri, rook h2 check, king g1, f5, so dumping that bishop, but actually he's going for mate on g2 if this queen moves. So Giri looks for his own mating idea like that, and the king will eventually get caught. Rook c5, king e4, queen c6 check, king takes e3, and after rook e5 check, actually Nepo resigns the game, which meant that Giri goes through. So it will be some final between Giri and Magnus, so-called friends, but a huge rivalry between them. So congratulations to Giri for progressing through. And as you can see, it's mate in 2. If king d4, then queen c5, and the rooks line up, and queen, like that. But the game came out down to this, and it was here that Nepo resigned. So I will see you in the final. Till then, stay safe. Cheers. Bye.